Why is it that conservative values always seem to lose ground in America? Why is it that it seems that we have now become a socialistic state, basically a Marxist-style state, with presidents such as Obama and Biden who basically align more carefully with the socialistic and Marxist worldview than they do any kind of Christian worldview? Why is it that conservative values have continued to lose ground in America? And why is it that conservatives are always seemingly fighting a losing battle as far as America is concerned? Why is that the case? We want to look at a couple of ideas here for just a few moments, and one of them will be regarding what Mike Pence had to say in an interview with Tucker Carlson regarding assisting Ukraine continually in its war. That is, foreign wars. We're always involved in foreign wars and foreign aid. We'll talk about some of that in a few moments. And then we'll also look at a representative from the state of South Carolina who very recently spoke about immorality that she was involved in continually, and yet she's a conservative on the conservative platform standing for Republican values, supposedly. So we'll look at all of those things. But first of all, I want to begin with a Bible passage, and that's in Ephesians chapter 6. And it runs from verse 10 all the way through down to verse 24. Now, there's basically 3 points that Paul makes, Paul, the writer of the book of Ephesians. And the primary emphasis is that we should stand upon the Lord alone, and that this is a spiritual warfare in which we are involved. So the 3 points are, number one, that we're to stand firm against the enemy, verses 10 through 13. This is Ephesians 6. Number 2, Paul tells us and shows us what is our full equipment for defense. Number 3, and he gives us now an exhortation to pray. That's the offensive warfare that we're to be involved in. As he puts it there, pray at all seasons in the Spirit. That is, looking for opportunities to pray. So those are the 3 basic points that are outlined here. Let's look at the passage, and there's a couple of ideas in here that we need to think about. And what basically I'm pointing out is that conservatives and those who claim to be Christian have been very, very lax in their duties pertaining to what Paul outlines in Ephesians 6. We have been really asleep at the wheel in America. But let's look at the passage, Ephesians 6, beginning verse 10. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. In the strength of his might be paraphrased, in his mighty strength. And then he tells us, put on the whole armor of God. That's the entire armor of God. The picture is of a Roman soldier going to battle. That's necessary because of what he now says, because he tells us now that you might be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. I'm reading from the ASV translation, but the wiles of the devil, that's not a word we use frequently today. It simply means the stratagems of Satan. As our Lord put it in Matthew chapter 10, this is the limited commission when he sent out apostles and disciples and the 70 to teach that the Lord and his kingdom is at hand. That's Matthew chapter 10, verse 23. He tells them, he said, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be therefore as wise as serpents and harmless as doves. What is it to be wise as a serpent? That is, that you have to have some savvy, some understanding about human nature and what's taking place in our country, what's taking place around you. Not simply politically, but also spiritually. We must have some savvy, we must have some wisdom about how human beings operate, and the manual that describes that wisdom, that gives us this insight, is none other than the Bible itself. So be wise as serpents and as harmless as doves. And here Paul tells us in Ephesians 6 that we are to be able to stand against the stratagems of the devil. Then he tells us that the warfare is a spiritual one, for our wrestling is not against flesh and blood. That is not against men simply that we're contending. This is interesting. Our wrestling, it's our contention, our warfare. Christians are to be at war. This is the primary thrust of the passage. We are contending for the truth. We must contend for what is right. It's not against people themselves, because he tells us not flesh and blood, but it is against principalities and powers and world rulers of darkness. What does all that mean? These are spiritual terms. They're astrological terms in this context, at least, referring to the fact that it is a spiritual warfare. My enemy is not personally those of the leaders of the Democratic Party, such as Joe Biden, Barack Obama, and all of the others who basically stand for satanic ideas, principalities and powers, and world rulers of darkness. It is the spiritual force behind them that is really our enemy. And he tells us here that our wrestling is not against flesh and blood. It's not against humans. Our warfare is not against those individuals who are pushing against spiritual values in our country and conservative concepts and conservative values, but spiritual hosts of wickedness in heavenly places. It's spirituality. So therefore, take up the whole armor of God that you might be able to stand or withstand in the evil day. What is the evil day? That's the day of combat. You better prepare yourself now, which many conservatives have failed to do, that you might be able to stand in this particular day of combat. We're in the day of combat right now in our country. So verse 14, stand therefore, having girded your loins with truth, having put on the breastplate of righteousness, having shod your feet with the preparation of the gospel of peace. What is the preparation? That simply means in readiness. That is, you've readied yourself by putting the gospel of peace on your feet. And above all, take the shield of faith, wherewith you shall be able to quench all the fiery darts of the evil one. The shield of faith, there's a good image. And then finally, take the helmet of salvation. You can see the Roman helmet, but that is now the Roman helmet becomes the helmet of salvation. And here's the only offensive weapon that we have, the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. And praying at all seasons, that is all times, in the Spirit, watching therein with thanksgiving. Now, in this particular passage, watching therein refers to the fact that we are to be alert. Christians are to be alert to the end that you might keep alert. So let's look at the main points here. Number one, it's a spiritual struggle. In America, what we are facing is a spiritual war. It's not against flesh and blood, but against rulers, principalities, authorities, spiritual hosts of wickedness in heavenly places. Unfortunately, those spiritual forces utilize men and women, flesh and blood, as their tools to get done what they want to get done. A Marxist-driven government now is being utilized by Satan in order to drive us into a complete Marxist totality. So number one, it's a spiritual warfare, and we need to recognize that that is the fact. Number two, you better educate yourself as to what is happening. I simply grow tired of conservatives who are putting their heads in the sand continually, and we have lost the principles of conservatism. We've lost the conservative ideas and ideals, constitutional principles, because we have not educated ourselves into what really is taking place in America. Now, what are we to conserve? You know, conservatism has this word in it, conserve. What are we to conserve? We are to conserve the Constitution. That is, preserve the principles of the Constitution. We're going to get to that in just a moment. But below the Constitution, the groundwork for it is the biblical principles of biblical orientation, the biblical framework in which the Constitution, or upon which the Constitution was built. Our founding fathers were exceedingly clear with one voice, one and all, that our constitutional principles, inclusive of the Declaration of Independence, were built upon the solid foundation of biblical concepts. So we are to educate ourselves into not only what are those biblical principles and constitutional principles that are built thereon, but we're to conserve those things. We're in a fight of our lives in America to conserve biblical constitutional principles. And that means, he tells us, to be alert. That is, you pay attention what's taking place. Why should Christians put into office those who stand upon a devil's platform? And I speak about the platform of the Democratic Party. I like people such as Robert Kennedy Jr., but you know what? He needs to get out of the Democratic Party. The platform upon which he stands is basically satanic. That is, redistributing wealth, number one, welfare system. Number 2, standing for homosexuality. Number 3, standing for such things as what we are seeing, that is, even in this time, they're trying to lessen the laws regarding pedophilia. Those are principles that the Democratic Party is pressing and pushing for. All of these and much more also. How about the New Earth ethic? The New Earth ethic basically tells us that, you know what? We are all equal to the rocks and dirt that God has created, and we have no authority over, and we have no management of it. We're not to manage the resources of the earth, because we are all part of the strands of the earth's web. That's basically the Democratic platform. So if you're in the Democratic Party, you need to get out if you have any honor of the Bible. By the way, Frederic Bastiat was a French writer about the time of the founding, just a little bit after. And he said, if you want to know if it's unbiblical and unprincipled, then ask yourself this question: if the practice in America or any political plank is unbiblical, and if it's something that is irrational and immoral, ask yourself this question: if I was to do it alone, by myself, would it be legal? Would it be legal for me to take money from you individually and give to someone else? No, that's theft. I want you to think about this. Barack Obama, when he was running for president, lied about marriage between man and woman. He said in an interview, and everybody remembers it, that he believes that marriage is between man and woman. He did not believe that, and if people had not put their head in the sand, inclusive of, and primarily inclusive of, Christian people who said we need to have a black man in office, and that's all they could see, they would recognize that he was a Marxist and still is a Marxist, that he lies about everything continually, and that he believed in homosexual marriage. That was clear on his record. As a matter of fact, if you doubt it, David Axelrod, who was his inner staff, confessed this in a book later. He said, you know what? We told him to say this because he would never be elected if he were to come out and say that I believe that homosexuals ought to be able to be married. So we advised him to lie about it. But you know what? There are so many Christian people who did not pay attention. They don't know what was going on. They might be conservative in some values, but they have no alertness as to what really the stratagems of Satan are. And they didn't recognize that he was lying, and all they could see was, well, we need to give this black man a chance. Well, look where we are. And not just the Obamas of the world, they're Republicans also. I'm going to mention in the next segment Mike Pence. Mike Pence claims to be a Christian, but he has sold himself on internationalism, which is an unconstitutional value. We'll see that in a moment. And also Nancy Mace, we'll talk about her, representative in South Carolina. We'll talk about how her immorality, she just stands up and at a prayer breakfast for Tim Scott, speaks about plainly immorality, says we're all sinners. Well, she's mistaken in all of that. We'll talk about that in a moment. But the point number 3 that Paul makes in Ephesians 6 is that we don't take up arms against government, but we are to pray. But there's no need to pray if you're not paying attention to what's going on. So we'll be back in a moment. Now, I started off this program asking the question, why is it that conservatives continue to lose ground? Why is it that conservatives are always seemingly fighting an uphill battle? That is, at least in America, as far as this is concerned. Why is that the case? Well, one of the reasons is because we have forsaken the constitutional principles that are laid out for us by founding fathers. And these have been stolen from us by this mantra of internationalism. So the divide is not in this country between Republican and Democrat, but it is between nationalism and internationalism. That is, those who are interested in America first or internationalism. Now I'm going to play a clip here in just a moment from Mike Pence. Mike Pence was interviewed by Tucker Carlson at a recent conservative convention, and he makes a very telling admission as to why in the world that conservatives and conservative values never seem to win. It reminds me of going back to the George Bush years. I remember when George Bush was elected, I thought, we came out of the Clinton years and they wanted to go to conservatives. And I said, George W. Bush is not a conservative. Well, he's a Republican. Well, what happened? Well, we didn't change direction of the country at all. Why? Because he's an internationalist, that's why. That's exactly why, incidentally, that he hates Donald Trump. Chris Christie, why does he hate Donald Trump? He's an internationalist. Mike Pence apparently is the same thing. So one of the reasons that conservatives, which normally has been associated with Republicans, have lost ground continually is because of internationalism. Before we listen to this clip here that has Mike Pence in it, I want you to think about what is internationalism. Well, it is a new model that was actually constructed in the days of Woodrow Wilson, the progressives, the socialists, and Edward Mandell House, who was his chief advisor. And they constructed this concept of this planks of internationalism, a model of political life that was characterized by international emphasis. And the word internationalism expresses, above all, the idea that we can't think about freedom, equality, and principles of law confined to our own country, but we must be involved in the world. Now, our founding fathers recognized that we would be always involved in the world. But what they did not want was political ties to the world. And that's exactly what I mean when I speak about internationalists want to be involved in the world. That is, politically tied down, whether it be for war, for financial assistance, for whatever it may be. They want to be involved, or they don't want to be confined to this nation. They want to be involved with international world. It's not simply, therefore, simply to cooperate for trade. It's not simply to be cooperating with other nations, but it is to be intertwined politically. Not just involved, but tied politically, economically, warfare. This is why Joe Biden canceled the pipeline immediately. That is the pipeline that Donald Trump was constructing, because it made us what? Independent. It made us independent nationally for our own energy. But they can't stand that. They want to be tied. They want to be dependent upon foreign nations. And so Joe Biden canceled the pipeline as soon as he came into office. I think it was the first day, wasn't it? And that's why Chris Christie gets irritated at Tucker Carlson about Ukraine also. But this is the statement, and I want you to listen to it. This is the statement from Mike Pence. And Mike Pence is being interviewed by Tucker Carlson, and Carlson asked him a question regarding Ukraine. So listen carefully to what he has to say.
I'm sorry, Mr. Vice President, I know you're running for president. You are distressed that the Ukrainians don't have enough American tanks. Every city in the United States has become much worse over the past 3 years. Yeah. Drive around. There's not one city that's gotten better in the United States. And it's visible. Our economy has degraded. The suicide rate has jumped. Public filth and disorder and crime have exponentially increased. And yet, your concern is that the Ukrainians, a country most people can't find on a map, who've received tens of billions of U.S. tax dollars, don't have enough tanks. I think it's a fair question to ask, where's the concern for the United States in that?
Well, it's not my concern. Tucker, I've heard that.
In that particular clip, I'm not trying to attack necessarily his Christianity, whether he stands for Christ or not, because I know he's a religious man. But he has forsaken the principles of the Constitution. His concern is not primarily with this nation, it is internationalism. In other words, he intends to stay involved in Ukraine. And he actually was critical, if we play that clip more on, he was actually critical of Tucker Carlson for suggesting that we should be involved in this nation primarily and not so involved in foreign nations. And he made a comment, something to the effect that, well, he said, I've heard you on this kind of stuff before, but that's not my concern. Now, Mike Pence, cutting it off right there when he said that's not my concern, he says, well, that's misinformation. No, Mr. Pence, Mr. Vice President, that's not misinformation. That's exactly what he said. His primary responsibility, he thinks, if he's president, is cooperate with the nations, not simply cooperate, but devote himself financially, politically, economically, intertwined with other nations, and this involves foreign wars. That's why we have always been in foreign wars. We have been in war ever since I came into the world in 1958. We have been at war with Korea. We're still at war with Korea. A temporary truce was signed only. We were involved in Vietnam. We lost that war. Why? Because of internationalism. And we continue to lose these wars. We've lost what takes place over there in Iraq, in Iran. We've lost all of that also. That's gone back to basically the way it was. Why is that the case? Well, because we have been sold a bill of goods by the socialists who tell us that the cause of war is national interest. National sovereignty, that's the cause of war, they tell us. And they associate the word nationalism with Hitler and make it a dirty word. That's absolutely foolish. If a person is interested in the boundaries of this country and protecting the sovereignty of this nation, they say, well, you are like Hitler if you want to stop the flow of illegals across the borders. That's why Bush opened up the borders. He wanted to open them up. Free trade, erasing our own ability to arbitrate trade matters and hand them over to world bodies. And we hear of the International Workers' Party, Socialist International, Communist International, the Global Trade Organization, GTO. What is all that about? World peace, citizens of the world, League of Nations, international organizations. This is a bill of goods. The dominant philosophy in both parties, the leaders of both parties, whether it be George Bush, Mitt Romney, John McCain, Chris Christie, the late John McCain, I should have said, Mike Pence, is internationalism. That's why they hate Donald Trump. Foreign wars, they want to make them unwinnable, and we've not won a single war since internationalism took over. So what is internationalism? Well, here's a plank of it: foreign aid. Foreign aid is international socialism, where the hard-earned money taken from U.S. taxpayers, redistributed abroad according to the whims of the globalist micromanagers. It's viewed as by the most ardent supporters as not just the remedy for suffering of the world's poor, but it is a just imposition on us, the greedy, exploitative, unfairly affluent West. Democrats, for example, such as Obama, said they wanted to double foreign aid. I ask this question: where in the Constitution do we find a plank that authorizes Congress to give 1 penny of money in foreign aid to any nation? You just don't find it. This is the dictators club of the world, the United Nations. This is what has happened since we've come under the aegis of the United Nations, and Mike Pence is one of them. Liberals wish to reinvent the entire thing, so we've pushed foreign aid, we've pushed foreign wars, we've pushed global economy. We talk about a global economy. We've talked about opening up the borders. All of this kind of thing is the internationalist mantra. That's what's taking place in America. All right, now we'll take another break. We'll come back in just a few moments. Before we go, by the way, before we go to break, we now do simply a podcast, and you can find and follow us podcast on Amazon Music app. That's the app that you can find us on. The show is, of course, Patriotic Pulpit, and you can find it on Amazon Music as well as Spotify app. Those are the two apps that it's on. Now, I still write for News Talk 1290 website. You can go there, the News Talk 1290, which is out of Wichita Falls. I write articles, and you can find some of them posted there. I also have a website. It's called American Liberty with Bill Lockwood. There's a donate button there if you want to, if you care to, and if you wish to, then please donate. The program always costs something for us to go onto the air and to reach out. And so American Liberty with Bill Lockwood, that's the website. The donate button is there. We'll be back in a few. Now remember, we began this program talking about conservative values. Conservative values regarding morality, regarding living godly lives. regarding the Constitution itself. And we talked about the primary point being that we need to always conserve the values of biblical principles and biblical concepts. Now, we talked about Mike Pence. Mike Pence, having left the principles of the Constitution, I mean, those are conservative principles that he has abandoned. And I think it's very, very plain in that statement. Now, here is a statement showing us another side of it, and that is conservatives have, by and large, unfortunately, abandoned the principles of morality. This is Nancy Mace. She's the House of Representatives from the South. She's in the House of Representatives from South Carolina, and she's a conservative, supposedly, and she is at a Tim Scott prayer breakfast. This is reported by Fox News, and I want you to listen to this statement. So the article reads that conservatives have mixed reactions to South Carolina Representative Nancy Mace's risque anecdote at a prayer breakfast in Washington, D.C. And that was a wrong joke for the audience, while others said, scolding her, that for the gag, it was a bad look. Well, let me tell you something. It's not simply a bad look. It's bad to the bone. Mace said Wednesday that her fiancé tried to keep her in bed that morning. They're not married. Her fiancé keep her in bed, but she insisted that she needed to get to the breakfast on time. So when I woke up this morning at 7, she said, I was getting picked up at 7:45. Patrick, my fiancé, tried to pull me by the waist over this morning in bed, and I was like, no, baby, we don't have time, not for that this morning. And so I got to get to the prayer breakfast, and it got to be on time. Now, she was joking about it. She laughed about it. She says, he can wait. I'll see him later tonight. It went viral on Twitter, but there's so many things wrong with this. It's hard to know where to begin. Number one, have conservatives absolutely abandoned the values of the Bible? Is that what we've done? She made a comment, she says, we're all sinners, and like, okay, we're all in this together, and that's the way she put it on, matter of fact, a tweet. She said, I go to church because I'm a sinner, not because I'm a saint. She said that because, well, people criticized her for what she was doing. So let's stop and talk about that for just a moment. Number one, she has abandoned the values of Christianity. Listen to what Paul has to say regarding that in Colossians chapter 3, beginning verse 5. Put to death, therefore, your members which are upon the earth. Fornication. First one he mentions, fornication, uncleanness, passion. All of these things, he said, put them all away. Evil desire, covetousness, for which things' sake comes the wrath of God upon the sons of disobedience. But now put them also all away, wherein you once walked when you lived in these things, but now do you put them all away. Let me tell you something. The Apostle Paul tells us as plainly as can be spoken that those things are to be put away. Number two, he tells us, this is Colossians 3, beginning verse 5, he tells us that it is possible for a person to live in sin. I hear people say, well, you cannot live in fornication. You cannot live in adultery. You cannot live in these things. You're a saint and you're a sinner. That is absolutely unbiblical, not what the Bible teaches. That shows us that what we pay attention to in this country, spiritually speaking, is what the world wants us to teach and what the world wants us to say. The Bible does not teach that Christians are sinners, number one, and we're not to practice sin, Colossians chapter 3. We're not to live in that. We're to put it away. To get up in a prayer breakfast, and boy, what's the irony there, and brag about that, okay, I'm living with my fiancé, and then go on and spell it out for the audience that what living together means, and says, I'm going to church not because I'm a saint, I'm a sinner. Just upside down. She's not paying attention to the Bible. I'm kind of curious as to what she calls her Pastor Greg, what in the world are they teaching? I know what some of them teach. I'm around a lot of it, a lot of people, a lot of churches, they say, Preacher Gibson says, well, you may have been doing this and been doing that, and you may be drunk here this morning, and you may have crawled out of bed with a prostitute, but I'm glad you're here this morning. You know what? We're not preaching against sin, and what she's doing is practicing sin. And there's no business about that kind of thing. And aligning up with conservative values, there's no business with lining it up with conservative values. Conserving, remember, means conserving the principles of not only the Constitution, but conserving the principles of the Bible. The Bible teaches steadfastly against her behavior, and it's not something to brag about. That's the problem. We have too many people bragging about it, and too many preachers or Pastor Gregs that are saying, well, we're going to excuse it. But here's something else. She made the comment, she said, well, I go to church not because I'm a saint, but because I'm a sinner. Well, that shows you once again that she is unfamiliar with the language of the Bible. The Bible does not teach that Christians are sinners. Listen to this statement. This is from Paul once again in Romans chapter 5 and verse 8. While we were sinners, Christ died for us. But now being justified by his blood, we shall be saved from the wrath of God through him. Then we have the statement in 1 Peter chapter 3 that God's ear is open to those who are saints. Now, does that mean that a saint, a Christian, one who is sanctified, does that mean that person does not commit sin? No. Everyone sins and falls short of the glory of God, Romans 3:23. But a sinner, the word sinner in the Bible is referring to one who practices a continual practice of sin. That's how the Bible outlines it. So I'm not a sinner practicing sin. I'm a Christian. I'm a saint. I'm sanctified by God. That does not mean that I don't commit sin, but it does mean that as I walk in the light, as he is in the light, I have fellowship. That is 1 John 1 and 7 now. I have fellowship with our Lord Jesus Christ, and his blood continues, that's the present tense, continues to cleanse me from all sin. But to say that I'm a sinner is to be misled theologically completely. So Nancy Mace is not only misled theologically, but she is misled in thinking that she can live with a boyfriend and practice these things and still be a Christian. No, she's not a Christian if she practices those things. She's outside of Christ, period. That's what the Bible teaches. And to think that people will say, well, I'm a sinner while they're being a Christian, that simply is not biblical at all. But this is the problem. Christians and conservatives have given up Christian values. I want us to think about the bigger picture here. We have given up conservative and Christian values, and we stand for things that are completely unscriptural, unbiblical, and absolutely against what the Bible teaches. Where does that come from? It doesn't come from the Constitution. It doesn't come from the Bible. It comes from the world. Once again, that takes us back to Ephesians chapter 6, doesn't it? That's where we began. Ephesians 6 tells us that we're to stand firm against the enemy. And then number 2, he gives us the equipment for our defense. And number 3, he exhorts us to pray. And so finally, be strong in the Lord in the strength of his might. That is his mighty strength. Put on the whole armor of God. Watch the Roman soldiers. He puts on his armament to go to battle. And that's necessary that you might be able to stand against the wiles or the stratagems of the devil. What are those stratagems? Well, they involve, number 1, abandoning the principles of the Constitution. Because our Constitution was based upon Christian principles, family values, abandoning the principles of Christian morality, as Nancy Mace has done. That's why he tells us, stand against the stratagems of the devil, for our wrestling is not against flesh and blood. We are in a war, and we're losing ground as conservatives because we have given way to the devil. Against principalities and powers, against world rulers of darkness, we are in a spiritual warfare. Against spiritual hosts of wickedness in heavenly places. Take up the whole armor of God that you might be able to stand or withstand in the evil day. That's the day of combat. Stand therefore, having girded your loins with truth, Having shod your feet with the preparation of the gospel of peace, that is, be ready for the gospel of peace. And above all, take the shield of faith, wherewith you shall be able to quench the fiery darts of the evil one. Not like Nancy Mace, who's just thrown away all of the armament, if she's a Christian to begin with, thrown it all away and says, I'll live with Satan, and then say, well, I'll go to church because I'm a sinner, but I'll be a saint at the same time. It doesn't work that way, Nancy. And take the helmet of salvation, the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God, and praying at all seasons in the Spirit, watching therein, be alert. So we're in a spiritual struggle. Educate yourself. And then number 3, you better pray, because our country is in serious trouble, even in the hands of so-called conservatives.